Welcome to Social Science Matters, a podcast series from the HIFNB with Kim.
And Jan. This is dedicated to exploring the important world of social science research in the marine environment.
Welcome on board.
Hello and welcome back to Social Science Matters. This is episode 3. Before you go anywhere, practical concerns and the matter of ethics. So today, before you embark on any social science research, it's crucial to address practical concerns and ethical considerations.
Absolutely.
Exactly.
Very, 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 very important. Ethics are crucial. Before we get into ethics, you also mentioned other practical concerns.
Mm-hmm.
This podcast won't deal with those in any degree of depth, but as with any research design, no matter your discipline or disciplines that you're working in, across or through, when we design research, we have to think about a number of different practical considerations to that research in terms of how we might do it. And that includes thinking about time considerably. So whenever you design a project, you have to think about how much time do I have to do this?
Yeah.
So for those who might be undertaking, who are listening to this, who might be undertaking a master's project or a PhD project, you'll often be determined by the amount of time that an institution will give you or a certain amount of time that you have to conduct that project within your degree program or otherwise. So time. Also true for researchers who are on funded projects, because the funding will exist for a certain amount of time. You should design your project within those parameters. Exactly. So time is a very practical consideration, and not over-promising things that you can't deliver, particularly when you're working with people. One thing, people are unreliable. I say this as a human being myself. I hope I'm quite reliable. Listeners, I hope that is the case. But I think the reality is that you are when you're working with people, it takes time. And so being realistic about what you can achieve. So time is a really important practical consideration. Second practical consideration is money, time and money, the big two. And also what can you achieve within the funds that you have or don't have. So again, if you are listening to this and you're undertaking or even a bachelor's or an undergraduate project in marine social sciences, is there any institutional money or not? If you haven't, that doesn't mean you can't do a marine social science project. You might be thinking about using secondary materials, which we talked about in episode 1 as one of the methods. So you could do more desk-based research. Jan, you and I had a global sustainability scholar with us during the pandemic, when of course it wasn't possible to go out and speak with lots of people, or at least do so in a conventional face-to-face way. And the person we worked with did a desk-based study, which is now published. And that's a good example of thinking about, what are the parameters of the project, what are those practical considerations. But so if you don't have funds or you don't have money, then you might have to think about other ways you do your project. If you do have funds and money, what can you do within the confines of that money, within that budget? How much travel can you do? What other additional costs might there be? Do you have to invest money in, if you're doing interviews, do you want to use a transcription service, or are you going to do it yourself? These are all really important considerations in project design, again, in the social sciences more broadly, but also in the marine social sciences. And of course, if you're undertaking any mode of field work, you want to consider things such as really important things such as visa regulations, and also thinking about any government advice that comes in terms of where you can travel. And those things are really important, and those practical considerations I've just mentioned, things such as government or versions of Home Office advice on traveling and what things you should take into account if you're traveling in different places. And that's very, very important in terms of health and safety. So oftentimes in many natural science disciplines, if you're going to do any kinds of field work in terms of maybe expedition-based field work, you would think very seriously about health and safety. Have you got the right kit? Are you going somewhere cold, somewhere warm? Are you going somewhere, what kinds of things do you have to keep yourself safe? This is so true in social science research. So much research I've done, I've met and engaged with people who I don't know. Those people are strangers. And so thinking about health and safety dimensions is so crucial. And anyone undertaking a project should be thinking about what are the the health and safety dimensions for myself. How do I get where I need to go to meet a person? Have I told someone that I'm going? Have I got a contingency if I'm in an uncomfortable situation? Those things are really, really important with social science research, but also in view of the participant. So are you also thinking about their health and safety? How do they get where they go? Have you thought about diversity? Have you thought about, can the person get where you're asking them to go? Have they got the time, money and resources to go there? Or do you have to help them or subsidize in some ways? And there's a politics to whether or not we pay participants. That's a different discussion for another day. But I think that these are some of the practical concerns. So before we even get to ethics, which is what this is about. So for people who are going, come on, Kim, weren't you supposed to be talking about ethics? We are getting there. But just to outline some of those issues that are very important, and they relate to the feasibility of research. You should also ask, in terms of feasibility in any kind of social science research, is asking those questions of feasibility in terms of can you do this? Can you access the people who you might want to speak to? Sometimes we might go, that's, going back to the previous podcast, episode 2, which is how do you choose your research focus? You might be curious and you might see a research problem and you're like, oh, that would be really cool to do, but it might be completely unobtainable. It's really unlikely. It's not completely unlikely, but if you want to speak with really elite policymakers, these people are really busy. You may not be able to speak to them, and actually what they might tell you would be quite similar to what you might find in a secondary policy document anyway. They might not give you any juicy gossip beyond that. So actually being realistic about, can you access the people who you would want to speak to answer the question that you've asked, that you want to answer. So again, part of feasibility is can I actually do this? Can I get access to the places and the people that I need to go to answer the question that I have? So before we get to ethics, all of that matters. And there are some resources in the show notes that can guide you through this.
Perfect. So, okay, let's now get to ethics.
Let's get to ethics.
Some ethical principles. Perhaps let's discuss the core ethical principles of research involving human subjects, such as informed consent, confidentiality, and minimizing harm.
Yeah, there's some tricky words in there. I think the first thing to say is ethics. There are ethical processes, and there is ethics. And they're two slightly different things. Everyone undertaking research should undertake research ethically. And what I mean by that is ethics in its very basis, at its very core, is a moral question. Ethics are about what's right and wrong, ultimately. And it's about harm, and it's about protection, and it's about thinking about how we conduct ourselves. And so when we undertake research, there are both a set of ethical principles that guide research. There's many different ethical principles. Most research councils have them. Many different institutions have ethical principles. But there's also our own ethics. So for any researcher, whether you're in one of the many natural sciences or one of the many social sciences, one interesting start point is to think about your own ethics. Your own ethics. What are your ethics? And I think for myself, it's often about doing research that is about what we would call careful or care-filled research. When you work with people, you're working with people. Like we're having this conversation now, and me and you are thinking, feeling human beings, and we have opinions, beliefs, thoughts, desires, passions, things that we care about. And so when we work with people, it's about working, what are your ethics in working with people? So when you start a project, we should always think about what our own ethics are. What drives us? What is important to us? What are our lines about what is right and wrong? That's a really important start point before you even get to the institutional guidelines. And so having your own ethics is really important, because whilst there are ethical guidelines and principles, those ethical guidelines and principles will only get us so far, because when you're doing research with people, certain ethical conundrums will arise. The principles won't help you with, and that's where you're left with yourself and your own judgment. And so knowing your own ethics is really, really important, and also having people to talk to about ethical dilemmas you may face. So having great colleagues like yourself, Jan, who you can say, okay, well, I've done this work. I was a bit uncomfortable with this. Can I use this bit of data?
Yeah.
You know, the person signed a consent form, but it seems to me that if I publish that wouldn't be a good thing. So have people who you can, within the confines of confidentiality. So if you're going to speak with other people about an ethical conundrum, make sure you do so confidentially, make sure you do so without revealing who the people may be. So even that has to be done ethically. If you're a student speaking with your supervisor, who will often be on your ethics form anyway, who you can speak freely to about those issues. So making sure you know your own ethics. If you have ethical dilemmas, people who within the bounds of those ethics you can speak with about those problems. But institutions have ethical guidelines. And so getting to your question, Jan, it's a very long answer, about those kind of core ethical principles. Many institutions have ethical guidelines to help give us a framework for working ethically. So while we have our own ethics, they also help to give us a framework as to how we can go about doing our research in an ethical way. It is also the case that institutions want us to do our work ethically. Of course they do, because what we don't want is an institution being called into disrepute because a researcher has not done their work ethically.
Yeah.
So it's about protecting ourselves and institutions, but it's also about, ultimately, the most important thing about ethics is protecting the people we work with.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. So we'll get a little bit to the paperwork shortly, but ethical principles, essentially, when we work with humans, when we work with people, and it's the same actually in natural science, you know, we should also think about how we treat the environment. So even if you're not working with people, ethical questions matter. I'm always amazed by this, actually. I think everyone should do an ethics form. Natural scientists, social scientists, everyone should do an ethics form, because if there is the potential for harm, you should be thinking ethically. So if you're going into a research environment and you're doing some form of testing where you're taking something out of that environment to test it, then you're changing that environment. That is an ethical question. Yeah. Right. So I think everyone should be engaging with ethics. But with people especially, what ethics is asking us, what those core ethical principles are, is, does this research present any harm? And how do we mitigate that harm? How can we be open and overt about the research we're doing to protect a research participant from harm and to mitigate those risks? So the core ethical research principles are about informing people. It's about informing people, what is the research about? What are we going to do with it? How might the information they give us be used? And making sure that they are fully informed so that they are not harmed by that research, and then you mitigate that harm. And so this is why this word you use, consent, is so important, because we must get informed consent from the people we work with to say to them, this is what this project is about. This is why we're doing it. This is what we're trying to find out. Saying to those people, you are someone who can give us an insight into this. This is how we're going to, if you like, find out the answers to the things we're interested in. So we're going to do an interview, or we're going to do an oral history, or we're going to come and work alongside you, or we're going to give you a survey. And then saying to them, we're going to ask you some questions on that. Are you okay with that? Are you okay with talking to us in this way? Are you okay with answering our questions? And are you okay with how we're going to use it? So are you okay that we use it in a research paper, in a presentation, in a podcast, in a art science collaboration that comes later? And so it's getting their consent for how we use what people offer and give us and contribute to us. And ethics is really about, people are not data points. As we said, people are people. We're thinking, feeling beings. So this care is so important. So ethical principles help us think about harm. They help us think about how we mitigate harm. They help us think about how we give people good, honest, overt information about why we want to work with them, and ensure that they give us their consent.
Exactly. So you already kind of touched on this, on what is beyond the paperwork, that you have to treat people with respect and ensuring their well-being and building trust, building rapport. But you wanted to touch on the paperwork more, or? A
little bit, yeah. Okay. I mean, maybe I should say, in the previous episode, we talked a bit about, at the start of your project, asking, well, what is it you want to find out? And have you got the right expertise? And very early on in a project saying, okay, well, actually, I can't deal with big AIS data. So do I need someone to help me do that? It's the same. Know very early on what the ethical procedures are.
Yeah.
Don't get caught out. Oftentimes people go, oh, right, I've got 3 years to do this project, so I want to get started straight away. You can't get ethical permission retrospectively. It has to come first.
Yeah, okay.
And what you will normally do in most institutions, all institutions will do this slightly differently, but you will be asked to complete an ethics form. It may be one, they may ask you for an ethical statement, and then a panel will look at it, or they'll have a template that you fill in, and then a panel will look at it. So most institutions will have an ethics committee, or a senate, or a panel who will assess ethics applications. And they will look at your project. They'll look at how you're going to do it. So what are the methods you're using? How are you going to engage the human participants you're working with? And they will look at 2 documents that you tend to give people when you undertake research with people. And those 2 documents are information about the project. So an information sheet or an information statement that you might get at the start of a survey. So I think you had this at the start of your survey.
We
Jan.
did, yeah. Exactly.
So there'll be a statement. And then a second document, which is a consent form or a consent box, where people say, okay, I've read that information and now I consent to it. So ethics panels will look at the project, and then they will look at these documents, and they'll make sure everything fits within ethical principles and guidelines, but also things like data management. So things like GDPR, General Data Protection Regulations. So how long are you going to keep that data for? Because protecting a participant isn't just about how you work with them. It's a bit like, well, what are you going to do? If you've interviewed someone and then you have a transcript, so the written document of that interview, and then I leave it lying around on my desk, that's not very good. So ethics panels will also want to know, what are you doing with that? Are you keeping it in a locked cabinet? Is it on a computer that's password protected? How long are you keeping it for? Are you keeping it for 5 years, 10 years? How are you going to dispose of it? Will it be kept in a repository? All of those questions are things that come up through ethics. And they're things that you deal with in advance, so that when you start a project, all of those things are in place already. They're just in place. Then you can hit the ground running, because you go and you're like, right, I've got my consent form, I can give that to someone. It's good practice to give someone an information sheet in advance if you're doing an interview. They can read it in advance of the interview, so if they've got any questions, they can ask. And so, this is really important. So most universities, research institutes, etc., will have an ethics committee, have an ethics panel, and have a procedure that you go through. And going back to practical concerns, it takes time. It takes time to write an ethics form. You know, I would say don't see ethics as it's a hurdle, I've got to get through it, I've got to do this paperwork. See it as useful to interrogate your own ethics, to think about how you're going to do this project and do it well, and do it in a way that is caring and careful with your participants. So sometimes these processes are a bit tiring, and ethics panels do go back and forth a bit. They're a bit like, have you thought about this? And then they'll ask you to revise your ethics form, and then it will go back again. This has happened to me a couple of times. But those things normally make a project better, a bit like doing revisions on a paper. You know, so make sure you've built that time into your research plan to do the paperwork and get the paperwork. Important thing on paperwork as well, 2 important points. Sorry, listeners, these are important. If your project changes, which it can do when you're working with people, sometimes just things can arise. If your project departs or changes significantly from your original ethics form, you have to go back to your institution and tell them. Because it may be then that your ethics permission doesn't cover what you've done. So if your project changes substantially, make sure that you go back to the ethics panel and say, I'm putting in another method, or something's changed in the question I'm asking. Can I get permission still to do this? And we normally call that an amendment to your ethics form. The second thing is, if you're still thinking, can I get away without getting ethics permission? Maybe I can just have a consent form and I don't have to go through the institution, or can I get away with this? Can I do it a bit more quickly? No is the answer to that. Most journals now are asking you to tick a box to say, have you had ethical approval for the research you've done? Because if you publish something that you've not had ethical, where someone's not given you the consent, they've not ticked that box to say on the survey to say, yes, you can use this, then actually the publisher puts them in a difficult position, because they may publish something that someone could then take task to. So publishers are now asking people to tick a box and say, have you had ethics permission for this? So if you actually want to go on and publish your data, it's a good idea to have you should have ethics permission to do that. So it's really important for the longevity of your research. One I'll get to this later because I know one of our questions will be top tips. So I will cover this a little bit later. Yeah. But yeah, so we didn't get beyond the paperwork there. We're still we're in the depths of paperwork. We're up to our knees in it, everyone. But it is important.
Exactly. Let's talk about practical tips. Do you have any last tips to get people off with their social science research?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I want to just draw on something that you said before. So there's a set of practical tips. There are practical things you can do, of course. I've mentioned some of them already, such as time, making sure you've built in the time to get the ethics permission. But there are other tips that they're not easy things to do, but they're really important things to do. And it goes back to something you mentioned, Jan, which is trust. So, you'll know from working with people that you build relationships with people. Yeah. And so ensuring respect, well-being, it means building trust with people. We've talked a bit in this podcast about not using people as data points. And, when we do a survey, and you might be sending that out to lots and lots of people, of course, you're not necessarily building trust with every single person who answers a survey. But when you're doing very deeply embedded research and you're working consistently over time with the same set of people, I know that your work, particularly in the Wadden-Sea, has been working with the same people consistently as well. You build a relationship with them. Do you have any reflections on that?
Definitely, that even when sending out a survey, which is what we've done, it is really important that you take that survey to specific people and address them personally. So don't just send off, like I've done in the beginning of my research stupidly, send it off to everybody and just say dear all, but send it off to specific people, to one person, address them in one email and treat them like a one-on-one conversation. Even if it's just in quotations, a survey.
Yeah, I think that's really great advice as well, because what I really like about that, going back to our previous podcast, is about this not being assumptive, like oftentimes, and I've said, if you're doing a very large scale survey, you might, for time purposes, you might send it out to a whole community of people, but actually survey results tend to be the amount of results you get when you put a survey out. Generally, survey response rates are very low. And so you're right that taking a tailored approach can be really great. And it's not just about maximizing your research. It's also about caring for people and saying, I would really value your opinion. Yeah, I would really value your input on this. And so that's really great. And it's time intensive, of course, but that's the point. Many social science methods are very time intensive, as well they should be, because we are working with people, for people. Yeah. And so that's really, really crucial. So yeah, building trust is really important, and maintaining that trust. So after you have done a project, ethics is something that happens before a project, as we've mentioned, in terms of interrogating your own ethics, doing the ethics paperwork. Ethics is something that exists whilst we do a project. So this is a practical tip. Don't see ethics as something that you do a bit of paperwork and then it's done. Ethics is something that arises as you do research. Yeah. So you might be doing a interview and someone may say something to you and it might trouble you, or you might think, oh goodness, wow, okay, I don't know if I can use that. Or someone might say something to you and then say, oh no, that's off the record. Now, you should act ethically. If someone says something, oh, I just told you that, but actually that's off the record, I don't want you to use that, you should definitely make sure that is off the record. Yeah. Don't feel just because you're like, oh, that answers my research question so well, maybe I can slip it in. No, don't do that. You have to act ethically during your research. But ethics is also something that we employ after our research when we come to writing it up as well. So when you analyze, particularly I'm thinking about qualitative forms of data like interviews, it would be very easy to cherry pick a few great quotes that help make your argument. But that might mean you take them out of context. That would be unethical. Yeah. Because then you're not actually situating something as someone meant it. You're taking it to help answer your question. Yeah. So ethics is also about how we conduct ourselves before, during, and after research. And just on this kind of before and after research, a top tip, maybe one I just want to leave our listeners with. Yeah. When you do an ethics form, one thing that's very common is to say that participants can withdraw their participation at any time. So this is very common on it. You'll often see this on ethics forms. So you can do an interview with someone, but a normal provision within an ethics form would say you can withdraw at any time. So if you decide afterwards you don't want your survey to be included, if you decide afterwards that I can't use this interview, that's okay. Mm-hmm. Now, that's a guideline of good. That's about protecting our participants. Unfortunately, it's also not actually realistic, because there is a point at which people can't withdraw their participation, because if we've published something, we then can't take their interview quote out of a publication later. Right. Mm-hmm. So you should always have a time span on that. So my top tip is, when you say about withdrawing data, you should put a time frame on there. Mm-hmm. So you can withdraw your data up until the point of publication. Yep. You can withdraw it up to 3 months after your interview. Put a time frame on there, because that also helps you later. That's great. Otherwise, you may be in a tricky spot where a couple of years later someone says, I spoke to someone for this research project, but I wish I hadn't done that now. But the ethics form, the consent form, says I can withdraw at any time. And then you're in a really tricky spot. Yeah. So putting a time frame on that both protects your participants, it outlines very clearly to them what their rights are, but also helps you as a researcher too. Yeah, perfect. That's a really good last tip. Yeah, thanks so much, Jan. Thank you. Okay, with that, we'll send you off. And we'll see you next time. And see you next time in the more practical episodes regarding methods. Yeah, look forward to it. Cool. See you. Want to dive deeper? You can find resources for every episode in the show notes. And please share your questions, thoughts, and experiences on social media using the hashtag #SocialScienceMatters.